Welcome everyone to the Labour Academy. This is the fourth of our book clubs, and we're delighted to have Liam Byrne with us to talk about his book on the unions of Australia. Tonight is a special occasion because I'm a great fan of Liam Byrne. I think he's one of the most exciting things that's happened in the Australian history world for a very long time. And of course part of the reason is that he's not caught up in the academy. He sits in the ACTU. He's very much a product of the academy. He did his PhD at the University of Melbourne and had a very thorough training, but he's out in the world, and that makes a big difference to the way you write history. And it makes a big difference to historians to be actually engaged and embedded in the real world. So that is what Liam is. And he's written a cracker of a book. It's wonderfully written, it's full of characters, it's full of stories of real people, but it's also full of passion and idealism and a lot of very careful, perceptive political thinking. So I'm going to ask Liam to start off and give a speech. I've heard him give before because it was so good. I asked him to repeat it, and then we'll go on to some other aspects of the book. So Liam, ready, set, on your marks, go.
Thanks so much, Janet, and g'day, comrades. It's always lovely to talk to other members and have opportunities to chat about these important issues. I'm very privileged to be coming to you from Zooming from Wurundjeri country, where I both live and work, and it's an enormous privilege to be able to do so. And Janet's very, very lovely introduction there has got me a bit discombobulated. I'm feeling a bit I really hope I don't let everybody down after that very, very, that very laudatory introduction. I hope I don't disappoint everyone. But just to say, it is an interesting sort of position to be in to write this book, that this book is written, and I speak today purely in a personal capacity, though, as Janet mentioned, that I do work for the movement. But it was something that I wrote very much under personal auspices. So, in other words, the blame for anything that's wrong goes straight to me, just to make that clear. So the book is called No Power Greater. I believe cover, put it that way.
Very nice, yes.
Which beautiful design work by the wonderful people at Melbourne Uni Press. Really what it is it's a study of the human experience of unionism, which was something that was really important to me with this book. Was I didn't want to tell a history that was just about institutions. I didn't want to tell a history that was just a list of arbitrated awards. I didn't want to tell a history that was just an exploration of, of parliamentary machinations that have led to industrial legislation. I wanted to talk about real human beings and to understand what it is that's inspired unionists through successive generations to build, to maintain, and to pass on their own collective organisations, even amid, obviously, what are extraordinary changes that have taken place in the workforce and the economy since unions were first formed. So in the book, I make two fundamental arguments, which are maybe a little bit different than some of the ways that the union movement's been talked about before. The first one is that unions have remained relevant to workers because the movement is driven by a fundamental humanising mission, a drive to assert the fundamental right of working people to be treated as human beings, not as machines or as numbers in a computing system. The second fundamental argument of the book is that unions are more than institutions, they're communities. So in the book, I use the term emotional communities. So communities of individual workers from a broad array of backgrounds and experiences who forge a common bond and a common identity through collective struggle. And these emotional communities are being defined by who they included, but also defined by who they excluded. And this book seeks to locate exclusions and social exclusions in their appropriate historical context. And it also foregrounds the stories of workers who are often at the margins of previous general union histories and considers their own organising and their action to challenge these exclusions and to win a place in the emotional community of unionism. And I should emphasise that the book's written very much as an entry point to union history. It's not intended to act as a final word on any aspect of the movement's long, complicated, and truly immense story. It doesn't seek to be the ultimate authority in any one of the moments or struggles it explores. It's a general history. It's attempting to trace a narrative and those major arguments across time. And while I very much hope that true believers and academics and so on will, find things in the book to latch onto and to learn from and to find useful, it's very, very much written for those who are not already long-standing members of the movement and people who want to understand a bit more about what unions are about, what the labour movement is about, and to really comprehend the fundamentals of that. People who are still trying to learn not just that workers have taken action, not just what it has contributed, but the fundamental question of why. What is it that has motivated those struggles? What is it that has motivated the movement? And why is that still relevant today? So hopefully the book will inspire people to consult the far more extensive literature that exists out there, the wonderful scholarship that, of course, that I drew on and was able to utilize in the book, and we'll find it as an entry point and not a final word. I'm not attempting to provide the ultimate authoritative account of any particular moment. Now, to capture the human experience of unionism, the book follows the life stories and the biographies of individual unionists from all across the movement. And the stories that I tell aren't always the expected ones. And they've been chosen really because of their representative character, because of the importance of specific actions and moments of struggle to the broader development of unionism, according to those two arguments that I outlined earlier. And this is an approach that offers a number of benefits in capturing the lived reality of unions and demonstrating how the movement's humanising mission has endured across time, even while its meaning has been significantly adapted and altered by successive generations of unionists. But the focus on individuals, I'm very aware, also has its dangers, especially in the study of a movement of millions, literally a movement of millions, that's defined itself by collective principles. The case studies that I've chosen to propel the narratives in this book, they're not intended for individual valorization or to accredit a select few with all the accomplishments of the broader movements, nor if its problems either. Rather, they're an attempt to personalize and to humanize the movement and to demonstrate a fundamental truth, which is the emotional community of unionism is composed by individuals who've joined together to attain something that they could not achieve alone. Now, rather than try to quickly capture 2 centuries worth of worker struggle in the little bit of time I have to outline what the book's about, I just wanted to dwell on 2 representative examples of the dynamics that I explore in the book. The first one, no doubt, is familiar to comrades on the call tonight, which comes from April of 1856, when James Galloway, who was a leading Melbourne-based stonemason, part of the Stonemason Society, was part of its campaign for the 8-hour day, and he penned a very angry letter to the Age. Previously also penned very angry letters to the Age newspaper because they are very often publishing things that it's worth being angry about. So James Galloway in the 1850s was particularly annoyed by a piece that had appeared in the Age that had been from a prominent architect called John George Knight. And Knight was very, very critical of the campaign the stonemasons were waging for the 8-hour day, because he argued that a reduction in work hours would increase the labour costs for the construction industry, and this would threaten Victoria's entire economy. This was a result, Knight argued, of an intractable law, which was, in his words, that the value of labour, like merchandise, depends on supply and demand, a term that comrades here may be familiar with. And Knight argued that the stonemasons' campaign for the 8-hour day distorted the normal functioning of this principle and hence of the market. Galloway wrote into the Age to refute this, arguing that Knight didn't understand what it was that was motivating the stonemasons. It was that they did not want their value, like merchandise, to be determined by the whims of the labour market or by the inhuman forces of supply and demand. The stonemasons, who were largely British-born, had migrated to Australia to escape the class-based privations of the old world and not to replicate them. We have come, Galloway said, 16,000 miles to better our condition and not to act the mere part of machinery. Now, I was really struck by that quote when I was researching this book, this idea of not to act the mere part of machinery. Reading through union sources in this era, I found that similar sentiments were expressed across the union movement time and time again. Across industries, across colonies, the unionists would frequently invoke the idea that they weren't being treated as human beings, but as machines or beasts of burden or as slaves. And union organisation to attain basic rights was conceived as a primary means to resist this dehumanisation and to assert the fundamental humanity of the working person. Now, it's important to understand the context to this humanising claim. This is a time of imperial expansion and largely unrestrained industrial capitalism in which the modern understanding of human rights, including economic rights, didn't exist. Large numbers of labourers across the British Empire were treated as little more than commodities, and forms of unfree labour were rife. Now, while slavery was formally abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, in practice it continued in many colonial contexts, including on the continent of Australia. Australia also had the experience of unfree labour through convictism. Now, both industrial capitalism and the British Empire depended upon this commodification and the use of unfree labour. But it also required a large workforce of so-called free labour, of working people who defined their status against the utter dehumanisation of slavery. But workers frequently found that they were free to sell their ability to work on the labour market, but the labour market itself seldom worked to their advantage. And the inequality that existed on the labour market stripped workers of their humanity. It reduced them, as Galloway lamented, to the status of little more than mere machines. Now, this was a commodification, one in which human beings, working people, had their social worth and quality of life determined by the vicissitudes of the labour market. They were subject to the inequity and dehumanisation of the unrestrained labour market, and as individuals, workers lacked bargaining power over wages and conditions, and they found that the value of their toil was determined by the principles of so-called supply and demand. And the first unions were an embodiment of the reality that the most effective means for the sellers of labour to elevate their condition on this market was as a collective. That if they bound together, they could demand and negotiate a better deal than they would ever get if they acted alone. As Galloway warned a meeting of bricklayers during the 8-hour day campaign, he said it was necessary they should all go together because individually they would fall. Now, the union movement's humanising claim was formed in this context, which allows us to understand the stonemason struggle in a little bit different way than we've tended to previously. Now, Galloway became a leading figure among the stonemasons of Melbourne alongside another recently arrived migrant from Britain, James Stephens, who is a bit better remembered. Together, they were pivotal in the refoundation of the stonemason society in Melbourne. And the society's core demand was a reduction of the working day to just 8 hours, because it's typical at this time for stonemasons to work for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, though they would often only work 8 hours on a Saturday. Now, it's believed that stonemasons in Sydney on 2 work sites won the 8-hour day in 1855. The problem was that these victories were limited to just those 2 sites. A later 8-hour day in victory in 1856 was achieved, but this was based on a reduction in pay. So they agreed to a reduction of their pay to get the 8-hour day. Now, these struggles did help inspire Galloway and Stephens and their fellow stonemasons in Melbourne. Melbourne stonemasons met together in early 1856, and they considered initially that they would just announce a date upon which the 8-hour day would operate as a new standard across the industry. But they decided that what they would do was that rather than unilaterally declaring that they would meet with the employers and try to seek an agreement. And so this took place as part of a large public meeting at the Queen's Theatre at the end of March in Melbourne, which famously the workers and the majority of employers in the trade agreed to the 8-hour day. At this meeting, the stonemasons were also joined by other workers in the industry, such as the bricklayers, the carpenters, the joiners, and the plasterers. And at that meeting, Stephens moved a motion warning that if any employer should prove obstinate at the time appointed, that the operatives or the workers would know how to act, they would only have to strike work. A proclamation that was met with a hearty hear, hear. And so it was decided that the new system of work would begin from the 21st of April, 1856. And so there was a delay of the implementation to give employers time to adjust to the 8-hour day. And so the 8-hour day was agreed to by the majority of the industry at this meeting with a real sort of like cheer and enthusiasm that was underpinned by a not particularly veiled threat by the workers that they would take strike action if their demand wasn't met. But crucially, not all of the employers in the industry in Melbourne agreed, and there were 2 holdouts who refused to allow a reduction in working days unless the pay was also reduced. And the stonemasons in Melbourne rejected this idea that their pay should be reduced to get the 8-hour day. One of these employers was called William Cornish, and he'd actually been contracted to construct the Victorian Parliament building on Spring Street. Now, the stonemasons knew that these 2 holdouts would continually threaten the new standard if they were allowed to get away with it. And that would mean, firstly, that some stonemasons would miss out on the 8-hour day, but also that there would be a continual threat that the standard could be undermined. So on the 21st of April, stonemasons determined to take action to ensure that the 8-hour day was successfully introduced on all the work sites where employers had already agreed, but also to put pressure on Cornish and the other employer to concede the right. Stonemasons who were building the quadrangle at the University of Melbourne, led by James Stephens, gathered together and marched into the city. Comrades here may be interested to know that the old quad, as it's often called, now at Melbourne University, now houses the Menzies Institute in honour of former Conservative Prime Minister Robert Menzies, just because there's a sense of irony in the university system after all. Now, the stonemasons marched from Melbourne Uni. They went down throughout the city and ended up at Parliament House, where the workers who were working on that building declared that they would strike until the 8-hour day was met. Ultimately, the issue was settled with the colonial government, which had contracted Cornish to complete the building, and the government changed the terms of its contract to cover the costs associated with the switch to the 8-hour day, largely because they were concerned about the massive public support that the stonemasons had for their campaign. So this was a really significant victory because while elsewhere workers had attained the 8-hour day, this was likely the first time it had been won through collective action and implemented as the general standard across an entire industry without a reduction in pay. But the victory also had a deeper resonance, and it was one that reverberated across the generations to come, because the stonemasons were also claiming their right to a life outside of work. While they were very proud of their profession and the social contribution they made at work, they argued that their lives shouldn't be confined to this role alone. And so, framed in the language of civic contribution within a colonial state building project, they were reclaiming their humanity and making the argument for the right to be regarded as more than mere machinery. And this was a formative episode in the establishment of the emotional community of unionism and a fundamental humanising claim that was pursued and won through collective struggle. And it bound the stonemasons together not just as fellow professionals who were potentially competing for jobs, but as a fraternity of unionists who were acting together for their common betterment. The second story I wanted to share is from August of 1883, when Ellen Creswell was testifying to a royal commission that was taking place on the conditions of employees and shops. So this is, in effect, an investigation into the conditions that prevailed across Victoria's factory system. Ellen Creswell was a tailoress who's employed at Beef, Shice & Co., which owns several factories, the most notable of which was on Flinders Lane in Melbourne. Creswell spoke at the commission about the conditions that prevailed across the industry. She spoke about long hours, of employers seeking to hold down rates of pay, and of the appalling conditions that existed. She spoke at a common practice of outwork, which is the sending of work outside of factories for women workers to complete in the home. Because these women weren't directly employed, they were frequently subject to hyper-exploitation. Creswell explained that using the labour of outworkers was a common tactic by employers to hold down rates of pay. Tailoresses at this time were not paid an hourly wage, they were paid piece rates, so they were paid per item that they completed. But Creswell's was not just a tale of woe and about how horrendous the conditions were. The commissioners were particularly interested in Beef, Shice & Co. because it was at that company in December of 1882 that the unthinkable had happened. The company had told its workforce that it was going to cut rates by 10%. This is on top of a 10% cut they'd implemented just weeks before. Now, in this era, women were expected to be docile and compliant and to conform to gendered stereotypes of passivity, and the world of work was very much considered to be a male realm. Among the colonial population, while male work was lauded as socially vital, women's labour was often seen kind of as a mere interregnum between childhood and childbirth, or perhaps sort of an understandable but unfortunate response to the straitened circumstances of widowhood. These attitudes fed restrictive employment practices that limited the work opportunities available for women, which then reinforced their subjugation within the household as it rendered on male breadwinners. But the tailoresses of Beef, Shice & Co. had defied these expectations. The Beef, Shice & Co. workers took a strike action in December of 1882. And this was an incredibly important action. As I said, it challenged the idea that women would be docile, and it demonstrated the capacity of women workers to take industrial action in their own right. Now, early in the dispute, as a result of the collective action by women workers, the company decided that it would make an approach to its workforce. And what it said to them was basically that it wasn't them, the company would love to pay higher wages, but they complained that the reality was in the industry, if they paid higher wages, other employers would undercut them, and then they would go out of business and it would all be devastating and terrible. And they suggested to the women workers that they should consider creating a union to enforce standards across the industry. Now, what Beef, Shice & Co. were not expecting was the enthusiasm with which their workforce would take up this idea of creating a union, and then the power that these workers got from that collective action and that collective organisation. So the women workers did create their own organisation, and then Beef, Shice & Co. offered to end the dispute to bring women workers back on the previous pay rate. And the women workers, the tailoresses, said no. They had no intention of coming back for the previous pay rate. They wanted more. They wanted what they genuinely thought their work was worth. On the 16th of December of 1882, which is a Saturday, somewhere between 400 and 500 women from across different factories across Melbourne came together, tailoresses from different factories, I should say, in a mass meeting to discuss their struggle and the actions that would be required to press their claims, not just at Beef, Shice & Co., but across the industry. And it was at this mass meeting that Ellen Creswell moved the motion that said that this meeting of tailoresses formed themselves into a union for their mutual protection and improvement. So this is the creation of the Tailoresses Union, widely believed to be the first union of women in Australia. Now, the tailoresses were extremely adept at communicating their message and were able to get a great amount of public sympathy. The Trades Hall Council called on all unions to support what they termed our sisters in labour in their struggle to obtain reasonable pay for their labour. Male-dominated unions donated at least £2,000 to sustain the strike, though it should be said that there were some male unionists at this time who remained hostile to the very notion of women in the workforce. At the end of December 1882, Beef, Shice & Co. agreed to all of the union's demands, but with a condition, that the union had to win agreement from all other employers across the industry to pay the same rates. As a result of this, the struggle expanded, and in a mass public meeting at the Melbourne Town Hall to discuss the dispute in February of 1883, women workers from 13 other factories came together and determined to maintain the strike and to force their employers across the industry to agree to union rates. The strike grew and grew, and as a result of this and the organisation of the workers, the manufacturers, the bosses, had to create their own association so that they had a negotiating partner. This is called the Clothing Manufacturers Association. Now, while there was some intransigence from some of these firms, a result of this was an agreement by May 1883 that was largely conceded the demands of the union. This was an immense success for the tailoresses, but it wasn't the end of the story, because individual manufacturers then sought to get around the newly agreed conditions by increasing the amount of outwork that they sent outside of their factories to be completed in the home. Now, so women workers had won substantial wage concessions through their own mobilisation, and this had enhanced public sympathy for the strikers and also awareness of their industrial plight. They hadn't just acted as docile victims, but had through their own collective action secured redress, challenged and those entrenched gendered stereotypes. They'd made their own history. They'd formed a new union. They were integrated into the broader representative structures of the movement, though this should be noted this was limited by male unionists who continued to dominate, particularly the leadership of the movement. But the tailoresses had extended the bounds of unionism's emotional community by demanding their own place within it. The tailoresses' action also prompted the expansion of a royal commission into broader investigation of work practices in factories across Victoria, the commission I mentioned just before. At this commission, Creswell was asked if she believed there was a case to be made for the creation of a court of conciliation to help avoid such disputes and enforce agreements. And she agreed, saying the employers had taken advantage of their workers. And she said, and I quote, "I consider we are nothing better than white slaves with our employers." Now, such a court was created in Victoria, though the tailoresses will the rest of the decade until the colony was drawn into the calamity of the international economic depression. So this reinforces the points that I was making earlier, that the early emotional community of unionism was constituted on the basis of exclusion as well as inclusion. The Australian union movement was formed from within a colonial population during the British Empire's invasion and colonisation of the Australian continent. The first unionists were skilled white male workers, and they created organisations to advance their claims on greater economic justice and a recognition of their humanity within this imperial context. And their ideas reflected this reality. Their humanising mission was prescribed by the racist and the gendered attitudes of their times, which limited its scope and its application. In the decades that followed, the bounds of unionism did expand to the unskilled and to women workers, though the racial boundaries were strictly policed. Unions did not generate the racist ideologies of the British Empire, but they did reflect them and they did perpetuate them within their own ranks. And Ellen Creswell's fear of being rendered as a white slave. The story of the union movement's emotional community is also the history of how these excluded workers came together, organised, and acted to challenge those exclusions, both in broader society and the union movement itself. So it's a story of the tailoresses. It's a story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers, culturally and linguistically diverse workers, LGBTQA+ workers, workers from other vulnerable communities who, through their own activity, transformed the attitudes, the practices, and the beliefs of unionism. And their story expands our understanding of unionism and worker action in this country. And the agency and activism of these communities is an integral part of the story of unionism and worker struggle in Australia, and it's a story that deserves to be told. Now, as an historian, my first responsibility is to try to understand the contextual factors that have shaped the movement, to understand how unionists have made sense of the world that they lived in, the ideas and the attitudes that they replicated and the ones that they rejected, and how workers in their unions have sought to remake the world that they live in. So what is it that's motivated workers to create their own organisations, to sustain them, to pass them on from generation to generation? And to understand that, you have to understand that it's not just a story of institutions or laws or of tribunal decisions. It's a story of human beings, as grand and as complex and as paradoxical as human beings tend to be. Now, the full complexity of that, of course, can't be captured in this book. I mean, how could it be? Because unionism is a movement of millions, and no one book could ever capture that extraordinary history. But my hope with this book is that it will be an entry point for those who are wanting to learn about unionism and its relevance in its full complexity, and that it will communicate something about the human experience of unionism, and that it will humanise the collective and a collective action. And most of all, I suppose, that it will demonstrate that our own era of disempowerment and when the global economic elite are finding new ways to dehumanise us and to set us apart from each other, that the union remains not just relevant, but absolutely vital. That for all of us who want to assert our fundamental humanity against those forces that would strip it away, there is no power greater.
Liam, thank you. In rereading sections of the books this afternoon, I mean, what hit me was in the whole thrust of Australian history since white invasion, it's actually been the unions that have mobilised sentiment, feeling, aspiration, ideals, values, which have actually changed the country, and that how much it's actually been unions at the forefront of everything that's made Australia a good country and made us a good democracy, and I think really the best democracy in the world. We go on about American exceptionalism, and it's exceptionally hypocritical. I just wanted you to reflect a bit on the significance of that, because I think within the Labor Party, amongst the membership, there's a tendency to think the unions are a bit of a nuisance. They hog the seats in the Legislative Council, they make noise at conference, they have, complexities of affiliation. But always what's impressed me at conferences are things that the unions are saying and the policies they're putting forward and the thinking and the hard work that's gone into that policy formation. So the unions are still driving the Labor Party much more than most members will acknowledge. Could you comment on that?
Thanks. I think it's a really great point about the Australian story is intricately connected to the union story. And unions have driven democracy and expanded the bounds of democracy in Australia. And I think this is one of those really important stories that we need to tell more often, is that there's always the assumption in Australia, just like many other countries, that rights are just there, that, the rights that we enjoy as citizens or as workers are things that have just kind of always been around, or they just appeared one day because everybody just got more rational and decided that democracy was a good thing, which of course is not the case. And it's the reason why I think it's important to recognize that is not just because that's an important part of our history, but also if we look at other countries in the world today, you can see how fragile democracy is and remains. The United States is a great example of that. Well, it's a horrible example of that, but it's a significant example of that. Europe is also, we've seen a number of different jurisdictions of Europe where fundamental democratic sort of rights have been under threat for a number of years now. And so it's important to know the story of democracy, because the reality is working people's ability to intervene democratically and shape the world around them is a result of the collective self-organisation of working people, and the primary mechanism of that was, is, and has always been and will always be unions. And the ability for the union movement to have this kind of dual nature, where on one hand it's a dynamic social movement which is pushing the boundaries of democracy and expanding what democracy means, including ideas about a greater amount of control over our lives at work. But also, on the other hand, is a stabilizing influence, because it enables of our democracy, because it ensures that people, large masses of the population, have a stake in democracy. And when, sort of democratic structures cease to give ordinary people a stake within them, that's where you actually get the sort of like erosion of democracy, and makes it much more easy for those populists to attack it and to override it. So that's a big part of the story, what I'm telling in the book. And when I talk about democratic access and democratic rights, I'm also talking about the rights of excluded communities to have a democratic say about their own life. So it also includes things, for instance, I talk in the book about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander movement and the connection with the union movement. And it's really important to me in this book is to talk about the stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander unionists themselves and the way they changed the union movement, but also their claims, which are not just for, things that the union movement may have recognised and sort of seen as connected to their own struggle of the non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander unionists, such as wage equality and so on, which are obviously really, really important issues, but also things such as land rights and connection to country, and to understand why that is so significant for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that needs to be part of the union struggle. And that's an incredible expansion of democracy and, the enhancement of struggles for justice. I will just say, if I can totally break from this book quickly, Janet, just because of the question that you asked. Yeah. So the first book I wrote is called Becoming John Curtin and James Scullin. And so this is a real throwback for me. And that book was written about the period of the early Labor Party, particularly in Victoria. And it looked at John Curtin and James Scullin and the sort of the ideological political culture of the Labor movement at that time. And one of the things I argue in that book was that in 1916, after the conscription campaign, which took place, James Scullin at the National Conference of the Labor Party moved a motion to expel Billy Hughes, the rats, from the Labor Party and the Labor movement. And I say this is a moment in which the union movement fundamentally asserted its place within the Labor Party. And that was incredibly important because political parties do not stay stuck in place. Like they alter, they change, they adapt over time. And had that not taken place, had the union movement not asserted its ability to have that organic connection to the Labor Party, it's entirely possible that party could have developed in a far more nebulous kind of like progressive direction, like the Democrats in the state, and would have lost that real direct organic connection to the experience of working people that the union movement and only the union movement can provide. And you think about from that point onwards, had that connection between the party and the union movement. I know it's differed a lot significantly over time, and I'm not saying it's endured in the exact same way, but had that organic expression of the needs and wants of working people been lost within the party, just how much worse off Labor would have been as a result of it. Not the least because we would have lost the great benefit of union leaders such as John Curtin and James Scullin and Bob Hawke. Not only would those people have not had that kind of direct, organic connection with the party, but the union movement has acted as an incubator of ideas and imaginings of Australia's better, more equal future since foundation to today. And losing connection and organic connection to that, I think, would be deeply detrimental to any political party, but especially Labor. But just, again, speaking purely as a personal citizen, making only historical notes and so on.
Yeah, no, well, thank you. I mean, I think that even at the very beginning, what was distinctive about the Australian Labor Party was that it was a creature of the union movement. It was to be a political arm of the unions, which makes it different from other left-wing parties that emerged in a similar period, that they were more loosely connected. There were links there, but it wasn't that tight relationship. And I'm thinking now that we're confronted with a very different type of left, and a left which has certainly overseas being vitiated by the preoccupation with identity politics, for instance, whereas the union story is pulling us back to the fundamental things about that identity politics is about, which is human rights, human respect, human dignity, your humanity being recognised, but that's passive need for dignity and humanity, and that you don't do it just as yourself. It's something maybe we've got to start to talk more about in Labor, about those fundamental values which have to be expressed collectively. You don't have freedom without a society around you that will acknowledge that freedom or make it possible. You don't have rights unless the society around you recognises those rights. And so nothing happens without society. But how do we get the discourse much more back onto the general human rights behind identity politics, which are important and have responded to particular historical forces, but we've gone to the point now where it's actually vitiating the movement. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, some of the specifics about the contemporary era I'll leave to the political scientists. To go back to the history and the formation of some of those ideas, which I think is really important, is I think to me, it was really compelling to read a lot of particularly in the 19th century from the Stonemasons until the end of the century, these ideas persist, but the way workers, union members, union leaders were articulating so consistently the idea of their dehumanization, and this idea of we are being treated as machines. We are being treated as little more than the work that we do, and that we want a right to a life outside of the workplace. Now, what was really interesting to me was that over the decades, that remained really, really consistent. I talk about this in the book. If you go from Galloway in the 1850s, Helen Creswell in the 1880s, if you look at somebody like Billy Trenwith, who was for the bootmakers, who was pushing for a minimum wage in the 1890s, is really, really, really similar language and conceptualization of labour's place in society and understanding of its place in the world. But I hope I also in the book give a strong sense that it was not just this idea that the sort of untrammeled labour market of the time was dehumanizing working people, but it was also the flip side of that, which was through coming together in collective action, working people had power. And they knew they had power and they could use that power. Now, it wasn't always easy. And one of the mythologies, I think, of the 19th century is that this is a period of economic growth. Hence, that meant everybody was getting consistently better off. Hence, it means an industrial struggle wasn't that necessary. Now, Michael Quinlan's written this he's actually written several massive tomes on collective action in this era, which disproves that very, very comprehensively. But this was a time when there was struggle. I mean, even in periods of growth and benefit where the struggle is easier for many workers, but not all, it still remains the case that, employers were not willingly just sort of like, oh, how can I make everything easier and better for my workers? It was a struggle. It required that. And the terms of the struggle were about, well, how do we reclaim something which is fundamental to our humanity? And how do we assert that in the way that we can, which is through various forms of collective action, but also more broadly, there's a labour press which is emerging at this time. There's labour educational institutions which are emerging at this time, and they're all talking about the same thing and a part of this broader dialogue. And so there's something really significant there about the way there is this collective conversation which is taking place, but also the insufficiencies of that conversation as well. And this is another point in the book about exclusions, is that in the way it was framed and understood and crafted, it is not the case that workers at this time and union members in the 19th century were completely devoid of, the imperial ideologies and the racism and the gender sort of understandings at the time. They were perpetuated, but they were perpetuated and they were also challenged within the union movement. So you have this really complicated, nuanced discussion which is going on. But it's one of those things that the humanizing claim itself was a universalizing claim. And like most universalizing claims, it was actually insufficient in its application. But because it was saying that there's this fundamental humanity, it created the basis for workers who were excluded from that emotional community to then say, hey, what about us? You're talking about solidarity, but what about solidarity with us? You're talking about humanity, but what about our humanity? And workers who were excluded then able to define that on their own terms. And that meant taking their identity as workers and connecting it with their identity as part of an excluded community. So one example I look at in the book, for instance, is the Chinese Cabinet Makers Union, which is in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is explicitly excluded by the European dominated movement. And we're saying, we are workers too. Look at our struggles. We're refusing solidarity. Our humanity is being denied, yes, by our position on the labour market, but also by the way we're being treated on the basis of our race. And so that idea about humanity and the way these different social exclusions interacted with and informed those class relations was there from the beginning as well. So there's a much bigger and more nuanced sort of discussion which is taking place, and sometimes the literature sort of has recognised in previous accounts. But it's a really deep and meaningful and articulation of working people's place in the world. But it's not simple. It's one you have to look at all those different perspectives to really get understanding broadly about what that conversation was actually about, which is really fun, and I'm very, very conscious that the book is just a starting point of understanding all those different perspectives as well. And hopefully, I always say that I really, really hope in 10, 15 years, my book will look as a little bit old fashioned in its treatment of this sort of stuff, because, the field will have advanced so much by then. Because there is so much work still left to do to really understand workers in that era in their full diversity on their own terms.
Well, I was wondering maybe we can finish up go full circle with the outworkers, with the story of Nguyen in the western suburbs of Sydney and that wave of Vietnamese refugees who ended up Cabramatta. I remember a tremendous film that was done by Andrew Jabakovsky on the isolation of those refugees in Cabramatta and their vulnerability to the organisers of the outwork, and they're working under horrendous conditions. Could you just finish up with the way in which that turned full circle and the garment workers began to recover some sort of control over outwork?
Yeah, it's such a great story in the book. I remember doing interviews with Nguyen for further reference. She's an incredible unionist, and feeling just after the interview and trying to be a very kind of appropriate objective historian throughout it, but then afterwards just feeling this waves of emotion, just of admiration and inspiration. It's an incredible story. So there was a big outwork has always been present in Australia, and obviously from the 19th century, as I mentioned, but it's been a consistent part of our industrial life, but predominantly on the margins. But it really massively expanded in the 1980s again, largely as a result of a series of broader economic sort of restructuring that was taking place within the TCF sort of industry. And so predominantly outwork was done by people who were particularly socially vulnerable. So it tends to be migrant women overly exposed to outwork. And the way it works is that the large fashion companies would basically engage subcontractors, particularly from migrant communities, usually men from migrant communities, who would then engage women workers in their home in very, very exploitative conditions. And the reason why it was constructed like that was because the large fashion companies wanted to avoid a direct employment relationship. Hence, they wanted to basically avoid paying wages. They wanted to avoid paying for the rights and conditions that workers would get. And it was this hyper-exploitative relationship. Up until the 1980s, the union movement hadn't had a great record in terms of engaging with outworkers and drive outworkers out of industrial life altogether as an attempt to protect industrial conditions of workers in factories and workshops. But in the 1980s, there was a real sort of acknowledgement that there needed to be a change in attitudes. And I talk about this in the book, that a big part of that was a new sort of generation of union leadership. And Anna Booth was a great example of this at the time, predominantly women, increasingly large numbers of migrant women as well, who were involved and actively involved in the union and were changing its attitudes. And so Nuet was an outworker from the 1980s. She was a refugee from Vietnam initially to Europe and then to Australia, and got engaged in outwork. And so she was very much in that sort of situation where she was working in the home, and, her horrendous working hours, 7 days a week, sometimes up to 20 hours a day. And there's this story in the book when she went out to, and like all our workers, she was paid by the piece, again, so not paid an hourly wage or anything like that, paid no conditions, didn't get superannuation or, well, to 1980s, but, didn't get basic fundamental rights. And she had this story of talking to her husband where she said, her experience was that she was like a slave. And it really reminded me when I wrote that about Ellen Creswell's statements the century before, and the real direct comparison, and how much had changed in that period, but also for some workers, how little had. And there's a story in the book where her daughters would often do part of the work with her for some period. So she was raising a family. And so they would assist for, some period after dinner or whatever it was. And there was this item of work that she completed, this garment that, she was in a store with her daughter, and her daughter saw it, said, "Mum, that's one of yours." And she looked at how much it was retailing for. I forget the number, I've got it in there, but it was over $200. And she'd been paid $6 for it. And that sort of experience of seeing literally on the shelves just how great your exploitation was. So Nuet did this for a number of years. And again, really, really important to point out, she wasn't just a victim. She was somebody who took action. So she actually went to a course that was being offered between RMIT and the union, hearing more about the union's activity. She went to speak to the Senate inquiry to talk about conditions of outworkers that led to a number of significant changes. She, as a union activist, did outwork outreach. So she went around to other outworkers and began to explain the rights that existed and what they could do. As a result of that, she was recruited to the union by its then National Secretary, Michelle O'Neill, now ACTU President, to do outworker outreach, and became and is still a union organiser who goes around and engages with outworkers to make sure they're aware of their rights and helps them actually get their entitlements and so on. An incredible story of action and activism and that fundamental change making. And that's the other part of Nuet's story, which reminds me of Ellen Creswell's as well, is that, that collective power and her own agency and activism. So it's a really, it is a fantastic story. It's, well, and I'm not just saying that because I wrote it, like it is on the West Side.
It is a great story, and the book is full of stories like that. And you see Australia being made. The other thing that always impresses me is the way in which it's really the unions that made multiculturalism work. And to thank Arthur Corwell, that people were very anxious and always worried about foreign workers coming in. Even British foreign workers were never welcome. And then suddenly they were going to have 180,000 people from displaced persons camps arrive in Australia. And nobody was very happy about this, and all around the world people were very angry about these people being brought in. And to their shame, every country had the Jews at the bottom of the list of people that were desirable, with the Balts at the top, and Australia was no different. But Arthur Corwell powered on, and he talked to the unions that the agreement would be that any workers who came here would be paid the same. They would not be able to be paid differently from old Australian workers. And so they came here on an absolute basis of equality. And because of that, it all worked. If they hadn't come here on a basis of equality, all hell would have broken loose. Multiculturalism would have just died. And so it's really, in many ways, the unions that are the most responsibility for making multiculturalism work, followed by primary school and secondary school teachers in Catholic schools and state schools who were taking the full burden of educating migrant children and their parents. So that's the army of Australians who made multiculturalism work. It wasn't people in the eastern suburbs that taking up spaghetti bolognese and black coffee. I think that's another very important story where essentially the the democratic spirit of this country prevailed when we ensured fairness. What Labor's and the union's mission is to institutionalise fairness.
Yeah, I think the other name I would particularly mention for the post-war migration program would be ACTU President Albert Monk, who was an incredibly significant supporter of that program and very, very important, very prominently so. And played a really significant role in terms of, breaking down some of those mythologies. And also, as you say, connecting the idea of post-war migration and full employment. So very much this idea that migration would fuel economic activity, which would help fuel full employment and can guarantee workers' rights in that sort of context as well. There's others, of course, and, many, many others you could mention, but I agree with that general point. I've got some really lovely sort of parts of the book which talk about migrant workers such as George Zengalis, who was originally from Greek and was an activist in a number of different unions, but probably most prominently later on with the Railways Union, now the RCBU. And Zengalis played a really important role in the Migrant Workers Conference in 1973, which was one of many that would then subsequently happen, but a really significant organising moment for migrant workers themselves to come together, hold their own event, articulate their own demands, which then over the years that became part of the movement's broader demands. It was really successful and because of that engagement. And there's people like Laurie Carmichael, who's a really significant leader of the metalworkers at that time and, demonstrated practically what that solidarity was with membership. But Zengalis did point out that, that kind of dual nature, that a lot of union leaders and a lot of unionists, not all, but some, found it really, really difficult to understand the changes in the movement that were happening because of the growth of a migrant membership that was dedicated to the union, often very militant. So you think about a lot of time the struggles in the manufacturing industry, particularly vehicle building, often driven by or composed of almost entirely of migrant workers who are articulating their own demands and, again, busting those stereotypes and showing themselves to be industrially engaged and militant and so on. And Zengalis so talks about the difficulties that a number of them had and the necessity to change the culture to make sure that unions were open and welcoming places for migrant workers and that was a class issue and the struggle that migrant workers had. But he also said the union movement is the only place really in Australian society that you can turn up, join, and you're part of it. And if you look at the difference, he talks about the social clubs of the elite, he talks about the universities, even, and what migrant workers, migrant people, migrant communities in general, the sort of, suspicion and so on that was constantly thrown at them, the discrimination, the disgust that they experienced from the social elite, and compared it. The reality is that, yes, the union movement had to change. Yes, it had a long way to go, but actually, look, it was far, far, far in advance of, the eastern suburbs or other well-heeled places and these institutions which actually continued to discriminate, either implicitly or explicitly for a long period of time. So it's not to say the union movement was perfect. It wasn't, but it was in a very, very different place in terms of that acceptance and, what solidarity meant, and very much at the forefront of that.
Thank you, Liam. I think that one of the things we need to celebrate is old Australian decency. That sort of decency is something that comes through very strongly in all of these stories and movements. And again, reminded of the migrants and Holocaust survivors who came here and discovered that people were honest and didn't lock their doors. And one lady lost her purse and was astonished to find it had been handed in to the police and none of the money had been taken. And those sorts of things came from a society where institutions had built trust and working people had some trust in society because they had unions that had their back. And when Labor was in government, it was a government that had their back.
I think I'll tell you one funny story. So it's about George Zengalis. It's a cracker from his sort of like memoir autobiography of turning up to for his first week of work in Australia, where he turned up to the factory on Saturday, only to be informed that, it was shut. He couldn't work out why it was shut, only to be informed that there was a 5-day week here and there's a weekend and so on. And it's, that kind of like, the disjunct that kind of exists. Nobody had thought to tell him, and that, which again is part of the problem, and you have to address that. But like that sort of like difference in what had been won in Australia and the significance of it, the way that was protected, and the importance of that was something that struck him very deeply, and was then the connection to the struggle that he had from that.
Well, we can thank John Howard for working very hard to obliterate all of this from the Australian historical narrative, and people like you are bringing it back. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that my father's name was James Stevens, not a stonemason, but a carpenter. who worked on construction sites from the Yallourn W Power Station, the Hazelwood Power Station, and Loy Yang. So, I mean, as a very young person, you know, I felt overexposed to the hurly-burly of what happens in the workplace in what would have been a very multicultural arrangement at those construction sites. But no, my point is this: I am underexposed in the modern era in the work of unions. I haven't been a member of a union for probably 30 years or so. I've been in the heady heights of a employer category, and therefore not able to. Nor did I have a union that seemed to be appropriate really for the kind of work that I was doing. But leaving that aside, we have no union members in our branch that I'm aware of. Each of them, if they're employed as self-employed, but most are retired people. So in terms of the way in which the interaction occurs between the Labor Party and the union movement, I am really underexposed, and so it comes as a right royal shock when you turn up to state conference and watch the interplay between party members and the union movement, and, you know, all the bickering and the factions and the fractions and that. So coming along tonight was partly to try and improve my own understanding of the union movement, even though at an academic level I understand that, but I needed to have a deeper layer of understanding in order to show the due amount of patience necessary to work through some important matters within the party where, you know, unions have a different view. So, I mean, you need to understand the way the game is being played and where people are coming from or where they're going to on various matters. So, thank you for at least adding some depth to some very important actions that have occurred in the past that have let us all lead a better and brighter future. But the issues remain the same today, I think. But whilst I probably share the same sorts of values as everybody else, man, oh man, it's hard dealing with some people who seem to be intractable on some issues that you think shouldn't be that hard, but in fact they are. So, but that's all right. I mean, that's life and that's working with people. But thank you, Liam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else want to have a word? Thanks, Sunny. That was fantastic. Rosie, if you got your hand up.
Oh, thanks, Lee. A long time ago when I was young, I worked on a magazine called Link and RPM, which were little newsletters in the AMWU at Laurie Carmichael time, and we did lots of interviews with shop stewards around some in Melbourne and in Victoria, and the shop steward, we would Roneo at the interviews late at night and then take them round to the factories and to the shop stewards. And we met lots of marvellous shop stewards in the early 70s, but the ones that I'm really remembering is a couple of Scottish trade unionists, broad accents, fabulous older men, and they were metal workers who, of course, in the elite, you know, they're very proud of the things they made, of their work, and but they were very strong communists, but the thing they really identified was it wasn't about money or being a slave or anything. They were very both of these people who were different, very keen on the Communist Manifesto, being a poet, you know, and having a lot of time off to sort of have a good time. And not about work. It wasn't about work. It was having leisure and being a gentleman and a philosopher. And that they were marvellous in their broad accents. And that was their vision. And I'm just thinking in this time of AI, it might be something we have to revisit again. Revisit, what we don't want. We don't want a 48-hour week or a 40-hour week. Maybe we want a 25-hour week. And we want more time for poetry or whatever it is, fishing in the afternoon. I can't remember what Karl Marx recommended we had to do, but it was page 1, I think, wasn't it? Isn't it page 1 of the Communist Manifesto? Anyway.
But I think the point about the metals is really significant, and of course the Communist Party influence is very, very strong. And in the book I talk about Laurie Carmichael and the struggle for the reduction of working hours. Actually, it's a struggle for the 35 hours a week, but it ended up part of the agreement was the 38-hour week. And it was really interesting because at that time, dealing with big economic problems, dealing with the transition of new technologies, and sort of arguing again that sort of idea that in that time, as there's new technologies coming into manufacturing industry, the productivity benefits from that should be distributed as reduction in working hours. But real beautiful, horrible, but beautiful sort of descriptions of the physical toll of manufacturing work and the way that it just brutalized the body. And if we didn't have shorter working hours, if we didn't have an earlier retirement, if you didn't have these things, that people would miss their ability to be human because the work would strip it from them. And whatever that looked like, whether that be, I haven't read the Communist Manifesto in a long time, so I can't remember where the poetry and the fishing bit comes in, but whether it be that, or whatever it is else that people want with their, lives, is that fundamentally workers should have a right to choose what they do with their lives, that we work, we make that contribution, we contribute to society, we also should have society contributing back. And letting us to live our lives, whatever that looks like. And that's such a strong echo of the Stonemasons I found in that strike, such a strong echo of Creswell and others, and that sort of fundamental drive that we are not just the work that we do, we're proud of our contribution, but we have a right to a life outside of that as well, which I think today, still, it just resonates with so many workers in so many different industries, because we're still having those struggles of excessive work hours or not enough work hours and so on. So thank you, Rosie. It's a beautiful story. I really appreciate hearing it.
Liam, thank you very much. You can see we're a small but beautiful group. And thank you to Sunny and to Rosie for speaking as well. And thank you, Liam, for a marvellous talk. And I do suggest that if you don't go and buy the book yourself, you ask your nearest and dearest to give it to you for Christmas. Makes a wonderful present. And it's one of a very great contribution to the corpus of Union history, which can be fairly deadly, and this is as live as anything. So, Liam, thank you, and everybody else, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. Good to see you all.